As a brain expert, you believe the brain was created, it didn't evolve. Why?
The brain is such an amazingly complex organ, 86 billion neurons, and each cell is full of DNA, and each DNA is like a supercomputer. But some people believe that the brain was designed and some people believe that the brain evolved. So let's put it this way. If you believe the brain evolved, you're standing on about 5 different pillars.
5 pillars.
5 pillars, okay. The first one is...
So the brain seems like it was very intricately designed.
Absolutely. You've got so many things working together. If you decided that you were going to change one thing around or add something new, that would actually have cascade effects, the domino effects on everything.
So the brain is incredibly complex. I'm joined by Dr. Dianne Grocott, who is a doctor and psychiatrist from Melbourne, Australia. So it's safe to say you're a brain expert, but you believe that the brain was designed, not evolved.
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
Right. Well, I've been interested in the brain for probably about 40 years. I did medicine, then I did psychiatry, which is not psychology. We use medication and we look at the types of disorders, which usually is that there's some biological connection where we can possibly make a difference, but we do lots of talk therapy as well, and we try and leverage the brain's own ability for neuroplasticity to rewire to work better.
Okay, so that's a pretty complex process.
It is a pretty complex process, yeah, indeed.
So, Dianne, why don't you think that the brain evolved?
Right, the brain is such an amazingly complex organ, and we can rave about that. 86 billion neurons, and each cell is full of DNA, and each DNA is like a supercomputer, and everybody knows that. But some people believe that the brain was designed and some people believe that the brain evolved. So let's put it this way. If you believe the brain evolved, you're standing on about 5 different pillars.
5 pillars.
5 pillars, okay. The first one is that everything came out of nothing. Like, in the beginning, there was nothing, then it exploded. Well, you actually needed a hand to light the match. Okay, that's the first pillar. Second one is easy. That's chemical evolution. That was non-life, became life. And it's pretty obvious that for life you need design, you need order, you need information, and that has to come from somewhere. It's like if you drop your marbles, they don't all line up, do they? And I was talking to my taxi driver this morning about that, practicing my talk, and he said, no, you need a hand to put them together. I go, yeah, exactly, okay. And then the third thing is the business of biological evolution, microbes to monkeys and then monkeys to men. And again, DNA is so complex, it's so difficult to put a new piece of anything into DNA. The DNA, only 2% of it actually codes for proteins, and the rest of it that we used to call junk DNA is not junk at all. It's actually a supercomputer. It's the operating system to decide what to do with all of those bits that do the proteins, because they're moved around and choreographed, and there's a 3D structure and then time, which makes it 4D structure. So the DNA is incredibly complex. And then so you probably can't get from a microbe to a monkey. And then they've even looked at how can you get from a monkey to a man, and the genetics is just so far has said, well, if you wanted to put in even one extra gene, it would take you probably longer by chance than is the time of, we think, is the age of the universe.
Longer than the age of the universe.
Yep. So the geneticists did this amazing model, and they said if you wanted just to put in one letter into the DNA and by chance put it in and it's got a stick, and then you've got to change it so that it's called fixation, so the whole population ends up to having that one. In other words, things without it drop off and those that have it continue. To fix a new gene in a population takes something like several million years. Wow. And then if you want to put another one in, it goes up to the billions, and it is just too It's not possible. Monkeys did not turn into humans. The next pillar, the fourth pillar, is a misunderstanding about what natural selection is. Like everybody, the creationists, the evolutionists, everybody can see that if you've got a whole lot of wild dogs and you select some genes, you can get yourself a Pekingese or a different other sort of dog, and you've actually lost information there. So when people look at natural selection, they see change and they think that's good change, but that's actually limiting the amount of genetic material you've got for good reasons. Like, we've been breeding dogs for many years and cows and things like that, but they didn't turn into anything else. So that's the fourth pillar. So if you haven't got an explanation for how nothing came to something and then something came to life and then life came to the complexity of human existence, and you can't assume natural selection did it for you, and you still believe that the brain evolved, then you're on the fifth pillar, and that is free will, which is that we can choose the glasses that we look at the data through, because everybody's looking at the same data and people see because they choose. And that's actually, I think, evidence for design.
So there's different glasses that we can view the brain through?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I've viewed the brain through all three. I started off in a church and I was taught all sorts of things that God was there, but he left, so to speak, and you just had to behave yourself. Look, I'm sure that's not what they were teaching me, but that's what I picked up. And then I went to a church school and we learned evolution, and nobody seemed to realise there's a bit of a misnomer here. You've got a God and you've got evolution. Well, if you've got evolution, you don't need a God. And so I decided to be an atheist. That was a choice. I put on those glasses. And then when I was 30, I was sort of looking for something a bit more than just the natural. I thought there must be something else to life, And then I met God and I was a bit surprised. I didn't really want to change the glasses, by the way, I know, because the consequences of being designed, it's lovely. But on the other hand, you might want to do things you don't really want to do. So I've had the different glasses on and I understand the difficulties of people changing their glasses.
So what was the reasoning behind you changing your glasses from viewing the brain as something that evolved to viewing the brain as something that was designed?
Okay, I think it wasn't the data, because I already knew the brain was amazing and I'd, done medicine and I was doing psychiatry and I was going, this brain is absolutely amazing. But I think that I had never really put together the consequences of thinking about this. Well, I actually found, I was looking, I met God, and was really surprised. You've been there all the time, and you're actually nicer than I thought, actually. And then I was actually exposed to the creation ministry information. And because my eyes were open, I suppose, it was like, oh gosh, well, why didn't anybody tell me any of this beforehand? That makes it it just changes things. It's like the light switched on. In a way, it's like you're looking through clean glasses because everything made sense. I'd done psychiatry and psychotherapy and I'd learned all sorts of different theories which are based on the reason why things go wrong with people in their lives and in their brains. And I expected that all those different theories would sort of point to a final common, it all makes sense, but never did. Mm. And then when I became a Christian, I'm going, hello, this does make sense. If you've got a God who made things amazing and people who were supposed to live forever, and then he said, hey, you can have some free will, and they said, yeah, well, you can get nicked, and then they walk off and do their own thing, and then he says, well, how's that working for you? And says, well, I'm going to have a limited time. I've made you eternal because, we know cells can last forever. But he said, well, if I let you be in charge of your lives and you muck things up, it would be really helpful if there was a limit to the amount of trouble you can get into. I've had children. They're now wonderful young people, but I tell you what, the long, dark tunnel of adolescence was a really tough time. And watching your kids make decisions that you can see further down the track will probably not be good decisions, but they can't see that. And you've got to let them go and but you put limits around them. You put a bit of a safety thing in there.
So what is it that is so complex about the brain that you find so fascinating?
Right, okay. You've got lots of brain cells to start with. You've got 86 billion neurons. They're your computers, and they're the ones that talk to each other. Then you've got your glial cells, and they do the cleaning and the organising and calming down they're like the nursemaids of the computers. Okay, now these little cells are arranged in regions. Okay, so where do you think you'd keep your frontal lobe?
In the front.
Yes, that's your CEO. Then you've got your temporal lobes over the temple, and they're to do with memory, particularly emotional memory. Then you've got your parietal lobes. They're up the top here, and they are your coordination ninjas. They organise movement and manage to help you with your spatial awareness as well. And then at the back, you've got the occipital lobe, which is your visual arts studio for taking everything in and organising what you can actually see. And then in the middle, you've got the limbic system, and that's for emotional regulation and survival, joy. And you also have your brainstem, which is below all that, and that's fairly boring, I think, but it does keep you alive because it makes sure that you breathe. It's very helpful about that too.
So there's lots of regions in our brains.
Yep.
How do they all connect? How do they communicate?
Right. Well, the answer to this is lots of different ways, as you'd expect. The neurons connect with they're things called synapses.
Okay.
And if the synapses would be like your social media. So they chat amongst themselves and they pass messages, and they use neurotransmitters, little chemicals, and they're like the emojis when you're transmitting various things. Okay, so that's one nerve cell to another nerve cell. And then the regions connect with, you've got a whole lot of cables everywhere.
So it's quite a sophisticated communication system.
Oh, absolutely. If you Google connectomes, they've actually done pictures of the connections between various parts of the brain, front to back, top to bottom, left to right. And, of course, they've colour-coded them all, and you go, wow, that's amazing. And researchers look at what parts of the brain light up when you're doing a particular task, and they find there's a reward pathway. So something happens and you feel good, and then the brain says, how can we do this more? And we learn, okay? There's the default mode network, which is whirring away in the background when you're just relaxing or daydreaming or being creative. And then there's a task positive network, which switches on when you want to do something. So that is really focusing on the outside world more. And that's supposed to switch off the default mode network. And of course, in psychiatry, we see people whose default mode network isn't switching off, and their brain's whirring around and they can't sleep, or they're depressed. And so it's important to understand the different parts of the brain, so when something goes wrong, you can try and work out where it is and try and work out what to do to help intervene there.
So the brain seems like it was very intricately designed.
Absolutely. You've got so many things working together. If you decided that you were going to change one thing around or add something new, that would actually have cascade effects, the domino effects on everything.
So if you removed one part of the brain, or if you rearranged the order of the brain communication system, you're saying it wouldn't function the same way?
Well, the interesting thing about you can actually take out a half a brain from a very young child, and often they can compensate. The issue of losing some of your brain, if you're a young child, neuroplasticity is such that that child can probably function in most areas with much less brain, which is great. However, if you have a stroke as an old person, it's a bit more difficult for a whole brain region to take over. Let me tell you something cool about the parietal lobe. Remember, that was the coordination ninja?
Yes.
Okay, so basically this part of the brain on the right-hand side controls the left side of the body, the facial muscles and the arm and the leg. And the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Okay, there's a little strip there. And if you have a stroke and you're knocked out the left side of the brain, the left parietal lobe there, what's actually going to happen is you won't have any control on that side. And that would be fine because the right side would keep going. Now, the right side seems to know there's two sides. So the right side would look around and try and look after both. However, if you knock out the right side, you're left with the left side only, and the left side doesn't seem to know that it's got a right side. Yeah, okay, because you can imagine if only the left side is looking after the right side of your body, and then it looks down and says, oh, there's a leg there. There's a left leg. Oh, that's not mine, is it? It's called left-sided neglect. People actually have that, which is devastating when you think about it, because they don't know. They can look, oh, yeah, there's a leg there. Well, they can't compute, because the information isn't going to the part of the brain that knows what it owns. And literally they might shave one half of their face, if a bloke, and maybe eat half of their dinner and read that side. But this left-sided neglect just is really awful. And you go, hello, you're still a human being. You're still a valuable human being designed in the image of God and made beautiful.
Okay. So when you're working with people whose brains perhaps aren't functioning at their full capacity or their best capacity, what are some of the things that you're looking for to help get them back to full function?
It's a good question. Gosh, they do research on that. Yeah. What am I looking for? Well, when you're working with a human being, you make a relationship with the human being. You've got to look at them literally through God's eyes and go, how, God, would you look at this person? And then I actually say, what am I to do here? So I've got to make a decision about what I can do. And so what I'm really trying to do is honour that human being, like why have they come to me? And, some people come for advice or help which I can't give, and I can tell them I can't help you. Try and help them find somebody else. Or there've been people that I've worked with, and I don't think there's an answer. Either there might be an answer and they can't afford it, or things are too broken and too damaged for them to be able to make much change, or we don't know, and that's the most frustrating thing.
So we can learn a lot about how the brain is designed by seeing it when it's not functioning well.
Yeah, that's how we've mostly learnt about the brain. You've heard of that, the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat?
I have not.
You have not. Written by a neurologist, and the most fascinating but really sad stories of people who had brain tumours or who had strokes and different parts of the brain wasn't working, and then they'd come up with these amazing things, and this particular man thought his wife was a hat.
Wow.
And it was just tragic, although sort of fascinating at the same time, because I think we're actually quite fascinated by human beings, aren't we?
Always. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how the brain does communicate within itself.
Okay, so at the neuron level, yep, okay, and I mentioned synapse. It's a Latin word, syn, S-Y-N, means together, like sync your phone, yeah, and synergy, and apps means fasten. I don't know if we have any English words from that one, but a synapse is the fastened together places between the brain cells. And brain cells have a main computer, their body, and there's a nucleus in there which has all your DNA. And then you have really long cords going from one place to another, and electricity travels along that. When you get to the next brain cell, if you just had electricity, well, it would go pff, and then you've circuited your brain, and that's not very good. And if all of them did that together, you'd have an epileptic fit. So it's really important that the brain cells have some sort of regulation of their communication.
Okay.
Now, that brings me back to design, because if you've got something that happens when it's meant to and it stops happening when it's meant to, that's design, isn't it? Mm. So at every level of the brain, you've got design. Anyway, so you want to talk from one brain cell to another brain cell. And so when I believed in evolution, I thought, oh, isn't this amazing? At the little edges where they're talking to each other, you've got packets of particular chemicals called neurotransmitter, and their particular shapes. You've probably heard of the names dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, maybe not GABA and glutamate. No, but the first three you've heard about, and they sit in little bags. They're like different shaped basketballs. And when the electricity comes down, the bags burst and then they pop out. There's a little bit of a gap, and then you've got the other nerve cell. On the other side of the nerve cell, you've got some receptors, just the right size so that the dopamine little basketballs go into the dopamine receptors and the serotonin goes into the serotonin receptors.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay, and how on earth did that evolve? All right, so you've sent over your little neurotransmitters. When they get into the receptors, then what happens is they go ping, and when you get enough pings, the message goes along and then along the cord to the body of the next brain cell. And how did that evolve? Because what do you do first? Like, evolution is supposed to be one thing, then the next thing, then the next thing, and by chance. Well, what happened if you evolved all of your little brain cells and your dopamines and your serotonins, but you haven't got the right size basketball hoops on the other side? Well, nothing's going to happen. And particularly as dopamine's in the reward pathway, you wouldn't get much reward. Anyway, and then what happens? The little you've sent a message from one brain cell to the next brain cell. What do you reckon is going to happen to all those little basketballs?
I don't know.
No. What would you like to happen if they were designed? What would you do with something? You've sent a letter and it arrived and the message transmitted. Well, you'd like something to happen because of your message. Okay, so you've actually got a brain cell that's waiting to do something as a result of the message getting through. Okay, so you'd heard of those three chemicals, dopamine, adrenaline and serotonin. Okay, they're the ready, steady, go ones. So you're about to run a race. You're ready. That's adrenaline. If you've got lots of adrenaline, you're tense, waiting, looking, prepared. Everything's focused. Oh, it's not quite. Everything's focused on everything. Okay. Serotonin is what keeps you from running when you shouldn't. That says, I'm quite happy, thank you very much, being where I am. So it's actually a calming chemical. And then dopamine is the go chemical. And with dopamine, we can actually see long distance, we can see where we're going, and we can see the pathway that we need to be going through. So once again, you've got to have design to decide when you're going to do all those different things. Imagine if you had lots of dopamine at the same time as lots of serotonin, where you wouldn't know who you were or what you were doing. And if you had too much adrenaline, well, we call that anxiety. Okay. Now, the other thing about the neurotransmitters, let's say we've sent a message along, those little basketballs are going to be recycled. So what we're going to have is we're going to have to design on the sending side some recycling pumps. Okay, right. Vacuum cleaners, they're easy to remember. So far you've got the little bags. You've wanted to send a message. Say you wanted to say the dopamine message is go, focus, or the serotonin message is calm down. Adrenaline message might be get excited, look around, or prepare for danger. And you've sent the neurotransmitters out to the other side, the message landed and someone did something on that side. And then what happens is they're taken up by the reuptake pumps, put back in their bag so you can do it again. How is that? That's elegant, isn't it?
It is.
It is. There's design there, isn't there?
It is.
Yeah, it's not wasted. Okay, now what would happen if you had too many of the reuptake pumps?
You would lose all your messages.
You would, wouldn't you? Yeah, okay. Well, I work in the field of ADHD with adults. That's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, that's what it's called. It's not what it is. What it actually is attention dysregulation and hyperactivity disorder. People think that ADHD is a hyperactive child, usually a boy who gets into trouble a lot, and in actual fact, although ADHD has been described in the medical literature for over 100 years, there was a time when it was thought to be a disruptive behaviour disorder of childhood. And that was awful because the poor kid who has ADHD actually just has a busy brain. His default network is whizzing around inside and he has trouble being able to get his focusing network to turn that lot off so he can focus on what he wants to do, except when somebody shouts at him, then he gets a lot of adrenaline and that actually helps. So the poor kid is used to being shouted at. If you're diagnosing disruptive behaviours of childhood, you're probably not going to diagnose many girls, are you? Because most girls know that if they sit still, even if their brain is whizzing around inside, they're not going to be picked up. So fortunately, we've got a better understanding of ADHD than we did even 20 years ago. And we've been picking up a lot of adults who've said, I've got a really busy brain. And sometimes it works really well and sometimes it doesn't really work very well at all. And how come that is? So I actually get the privilege of helping them to put some glasses on to be able to see their own brain and be able to understand what's going on there. And ADHD it's very common. It's about 5% of the population.
Well, 5%.
5%. It's quite a lot. and it is genetic. So in terms of the things that are genetic, eye colour is high, very genetic. We know that. Height as well, and ADHD is just under there. Lots of other disorders we have like depression and schizophrenia, which have biological bases, are less genetic. There's more environmental factors involved. But anyway, so it's genetic. So what do we do if we diagnose one person in the family and the other people in the family are going, hang on, I thought this was hyperactive boys. No. This is a person with a busy brain who's trying really hard to focus. Sometimes they focus well and sometimes they don't. And then lots of other people in the family come up and go, oh, I think I've got that too. Then they go, yeah, but it's not a bad thing most of the time. If my busy brain is busy, I'm creative and I'm an entrepreneur, or I'm really fun with the kids. A lot of people go, well, I've got a busy brain, but I'm fine. And other people come and they go, I've got a busy brain and I'm exhausted from trying to focus. Or I was really good when I was managing things where there was a bit of scaffolding around me where I didn't, someone else told me what to do. So we have kids who come in high school. They were fine in year 9 because everybody's brain's all over the place. And then we get them at year 10 and 11 and 12 and they go, I just can't focus. So we teach them what's going on with their brains and we help them to be able to manage.
That is amazing. So you're saying that the well-designed communication system in our brains has kind of gone off kilter.
Yeah. There's actually a biological advantage. It's called the hunter-gatherer genes, the Viking genes. Now, I'll tell you where the main genetic change is in those little reuptake vacuum cleaners in the synapses, particularly in your frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain that does the project management of everything else.
Yep.
Okay, so if you had extra vacuum cleaners, and there's the chemical dopamine is probably the main one, you send out your dopamine. If you've got extra vacuum cleaners, it gets sucked up too fast, so you don't get the dopamine messages. And dopamine's to do with that task positive network of looking, focusing, staying on track, going to a goal. If you haven't got dopamine messages, the default network is going along and you're busy thinking about all sorts of different things. Or you might hyper-focus on one particular thing and then you can't stop to be able to do the next thing that you need to be able to do. Okay, so that's not the entire story for ADHD because the whole of the brain is involved, particularly the cerebellum, which sort of evens things out for movement as well as evens things out for thinking. But you've got your frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain which is managing everything and using dopamine as a message to say we need to focus on that and not on that. And the messages are intermittent, which is really interesting when you think about it. If the receptors weren't working at all, that's receiving, you wouldn't get any messages. But if you've got a problem with extra vacuum cleaners in the reuptake ones, what happens is you send out a packet of dopamine, and if you send out a lot, you get a message going through and you're quite normal. And if you send out a small amount, a lot of that gets sucked back up and you don't get the messages coming through. So most people with ADHD have learned if they're in an environment where there's lots of dopamine, lots of fun and excitement or drama or fear, they're often wonderful in a crisis. And they go, oh, in a crisis I can think clearly, but otherwise I just can't get my work done. So they've actually discovered that if they're in some areas where there's lots of dopamine, they do well, or they find things to give them dopamine. And remember we mentioned the reward network?
Yes.
That runs on dopamine as well. And everything that gives a reward goes through, will give you a shot of dopamine. Alcohol, all the bad drugs, caffeine, sugar. Sugar gives a lot of dopamine. And a lot of people who've got these busy brains, they get to the point of they either get addicted to or they've learned, if I give myself a shot of sugar or something else, I'm going to be able to function very well. So that causes a lot of trouble because we've got this brain where the brain is running the life, and if you're doing something which is making your life worse, then you start to get depressed and anxious, and then they come in to see us and we go, oh, have you got a busy brain? And they go, yeah, I've always had a busy brain. And then it's a matter of helping them to understand how their brain works, and then maybe they can make some healthy choices to up their dopamine instead. So let me tell you about dopamine. So where do we get that? you think it just floats into the brain? No. Okay. And this is where the whole body is designed, and we're also designed to be in our own environment, because where you get dopamine from, it's a little chemical. It comes from another amino acid called tyrosine, and tyrosine comes from protein, or your gut bacteria can make it. So you've got your brain, and if it had just evolved, I think, how did it evolve that everything fits in with everything? So to get your dopamine, you've actually got to have either good gut bacteria, or you've got to have a source of protein, which means you've got to have some legs to run around, and you've got to be able to chew your protein and absorb it and digest it, and then you've got to transport it to your brain. So if we just look at dopamine, you go, the whole body is connected. And because I work in that field where people have this dopamine problem, I basically trawl through all of their life and their medical history and their family history and go, okay, do you have anything wrong with your gut? Because if your gut isn't working properly, your dopamine might not work.
Wow.
And there are some people who have celiac disease, so they are allergic to gluten. So if they have gluten, the gut doesn't work terribly well at all, and then they get brain fog. If they have ADHD, it gets worse, and if they don't have ADHD, they have those symptoms. And once we can help them with the gluten and their brain and their gut heals, I've seen people who've said, oh, my brain's working fine now. Or the people with ADHD say, my brain's working better than it was. So we go and we look at, and then the other thing is, where else do you get dopamine from? Well, you need a little protein factory to make the tyrosine into actually L-dopa, which is then turned into dopamine, which is then going to adrenaline. Where do you get little factories from? Well, they're made by the DNA. And where do you get the things to make the factories? Well, they're proteins, so you've got to have all the essential amino acids. So again, you've got to have a village to feed you to actually survive, to do these things. So everything is interlinked. That's design. That's not evolution.
I mean, it's just staggering to listen to all the processes that a message has to go through, or where they get their energy so that the brain can function well. So you're not really just talking about the brain not being able to evolve on its own, because it needs the body at the same time.
Yeah, but the body needs the brain, and everything's interconnected, and there's no way that happened bit by bit by bit. Even if it could, time and chance, they say, is the thing. Well, chance, it's not going to work, because it would take you billions of years. And you still need to have design. You still need someone to make it.
So why does this matter? Why does it matter what glasses we view the brain through, and whether the brain did evolve or whether it was designed and created? Why does that matter to us today?
That's a really good question, actually. So let's just say our brains evolved. As Richard Dawkins says, we're a mote in the universe floating around, nobody cares, and get over it. Well, that doesn't actually fit with people, does it? Because people are goal-focused. We are, if we weren't designed, why is it that we keep designing things? Design is you think of something, you want something, you make it and you produce it, and you have joy with that. And that can't be explained by evolution. But when society thinks that everybody evolved, you start to find that there's not so much wonder, there's not so much respect. You look at a person and you go, well, how useful are you? And if you're not useful, well, let's get rid of you, which would be great if you were a machine. If you're no good, you can scrap you. But if you're a child whose mum can't look after you, well, we can get rid of that business there. And what if you're an older person who nobody wants to pay for? Well, let's get rid of that business there. And you get to the point where society changes the way they see everything, the way they see themselves, the way they see each other, and you lose the love and the joy.
So you're saying that in order to see people with true respect and wonder and admiration and care, it's helpful to have this idea that they were designed specifically by a creator.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me tell you two parts of the brain. We've talked about the frontal lobe and the limbic system. The limbic system sees one perspective at a time. And the limbic system is basically what gets activated if you say you saw a snake. You're totally focused on survival, and the alarm bells go and you're going to decide to run or hit it, probably. The frontal lobe sees two perspectives, and the nerves in the frontal lobe can actually hold two ideas at the same time without having to kill off one of them. So the limbic system is either black or white, and it's like war zone. It's fear-based, as if there's a lack, whereas the frontal lobe sees two perspectives at the same time without having to kill off one of them. So you can look at a person with your frontal lobe and you can go, I don't like that behaviour, but I can still like you. There's that but. And because there's that but, there's choice. You can choose if you're nice or not to them. If you're coming out of your limbic system, basically it's a fear-based thing. It's one perspective, which is me, and I need to survive at your expense probably, and I can look at you with black or white and I can decide whether I do or don't want to interact with you at all. And I have no choice. If I'm using my limbic system, I have no choice. It's in there. It's wired for survival. If I've got a frontal lobe, that calms everything down and I can go, oh, okay, well, I was upset by you, but there is a future. So in the limbic system, there's a now and there's no future. When you were born, you had your 100 billion neurons. They weren't all linked up, but your limbic system was linked up. So there's a lovely little hand model. Here's your limbic system. There's the brainstem. Here's your frontal lobes, and they have the thinker, the other-centeredness, the conscience, and the brakes. That's the part that controls. This is the part that just reacts, and this is the part that basically keeps you alive, okay? And I've left the other bits out because we're just for this purposes. So you're born with all those neurons. If that one's working, you don't have any way of calming yourself down. You need a parent to be able to calm yourself down. And then eventually you grow your little frontal lobes, or they get connected. And then when there's a problem, you can calm yourself down. And here's a child, I don't know, top of primary school. They're so lovely. They have little problems and they can solve them themselves, and they're so lovely. And then you get to puberty, where this frontal lobe, what they have grown, is getting rewired, so it's going to function faster like an adult. But for the time being, it's not working whatsoever. So this is year 9, I think. Yeah, you work with year 9s, don't you? And they need a certain amount of scaffolding around them, and then they grow. And someone said, keep them alive till they're 25 when they've got their full frontal lobe. And eventually we have an adult ability we've got a problem, we get upset, we can calm ourselves down. Yeah, now here's a question. If this is the part of the brain that can see two perspectives because it can see now and later, or good and bad, or me and you at the same time, where did that come from in the evolutionary idea?
Don't know. Would you really need your frontal lobe in the evolutionary perspective?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, isn't it? Because the human frontal lobe, or at least part of the frontal lobe, is so different from any other living anything on the planet. And we've got the ability to have language and symbolism. We have abstract thought, altruism, and a lot of animals have some of that. But as is so well developed, we have the capacity for music, the capacity for spiritual awareness, and all of that is what makes us human. I can't see that having come from evolution. And that's one of the other reasons why I think that the whole brain has been designed. And the issue there is that if we've been designed, there's a designer. And then the next question is, why are we scared of the designer? We think about it. If you're in your limbic system, if you've done something wrong and you know your parent, who's the frontal lobe, is going to come along, and you know that they ought to tell you off and they ought to jump on you badly, and you don't want that to happen, and you're in the one-person perspective, you are going to run or hide or lie or do all the different things you're going to do. And it takes a lot of learning and probably courage to stand up and wait for the parent to come along, and where you might have to cop a punishment. And from yourself, just in a limbic system, you can't imagine frontal lobes. You can't imagine that a parent would say, I love you, even if you've done something wrong. So as humans, it's like we're the limbic system, and we assume God doesn't have a frontal lobe because we can't even imagine it. And then God goes, I have a frontal lobe. Hello. I knew you were going to do what you did, like we do with our children. And I think that's one of the amazing things about families is we get to see a little bit of the whole big picture. Like, humans to God, if we didn't have parents to love our kids, we wouldn't be able to go, oh, maybe God loves me like I love my kid. And that's really, really important. But if everything evolved, you don't need families. So there's a lot of consequences of whether we've chosen to look through the glasses of our brain being designed or our brain evolving.
Oh, Dianne, this has been amazing. Is there anything that you think it's important to share with us before we close?
Well, I started off by claiming that the human brain is designed, not evolved. Therefore, there's a designer. This is important. The designer actually, I think, allows us to have the glasses of saying, no, I don't want to know you. But there are consequences. And I think it's also important to know that if we do choose some glasses that look through design, then we're actually going to open up such a change in the way we see life, ourselves, our future. It's just absolutely amazing.
Well, Dr. Grocott, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.